Mikhail Gorbachev, 1931 to 2022. The most important political event of the last 40 years has been the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the collapse of communism. That movement, which for decades threatened to engulf the whole world, has declined with startling speed and now seems to be headed for the dustbin of history. One man stands out as the pivotal figure in that astonishing decline and fall: Mikhail Gorbachev, the man who headed the USSR during its last 6 years, 1985 to 1991. Gorbachev was born in 1931 in the village of Privolnoy in the Stavropol region of southern Russia. His childhood coincided with the most brutal period of the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, one of the bloodiest tyrants in history. Indeed, Mikhail's own grandfather, Andrei, spent 9 years in Stalin's prison camps and was not released until 1941, only a few months before Germany invaded Russia. Mikhail himself was too young to serve in World War II, but his father served in the army. His older brother died in action, and Privolnoy was occupied by the Germans for about 8 months. None of this, however, delayed Gorbachev's career. He got excellent grades in school, joined Komsomol when he was 15, and then worked for 4 years as the operator of a combine harvester. He entered Moscow State University in 1950, studied law there, and graduated in 1955. It was there in 1952 that he became a member of the Communist Party, and there that he met his future wife, Raisa Maximovna Titurenko. They married shortly before his graduation and have one child, Irina. After receiving his law degree, Gorbachev returned to Stavropol and commenced his gradual rise through the party bureaucracy. In 1970, he became first secretary of the regional party committee, and the following year he was appointed a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. He got a big promotion in 1978 when he moved to Moscow to become a secretary of the Central Committee, in charge of agriculture. In 1979, Gorbachev became a candidate member of the Politburo, which was effectively the ruling body of the Soviet Union, and in 1980 he became a full member. All these promotions occurred during the period 1964 to 1982, when Leonid Brezhnev headed the Soviet Union. Brezhnev's death was followed by the brief reigns of Andropov and Chernenko, and it was during those years that Gorbachev became a prominent member of the Politburo. Chernenko died on March 11, 1985, and the very next day Gorbachev was named to succeed him as Secretary General. The Politburo voted in secret, but it is rumored that Gorbachev's election was by only a small margin over Viktor Grishin, a quite conservative figure. How different history might have been if only 2 or 3% had voted the other way. Unlike most Soviet leaders, Gorbachev had traveled abroad: France in 1966, Italy in 1967, Canada in 1983, England in 1984, before he became party leader. So when he was elected, many Westerners hoped that Gorbachev would be a more modern and liberal leader than his predecessors had been. This turned out to be the case. But nobody anticipated the speed and magnitude of the reforms that he would make. The Soviet Union faced many serious problems when Gorbachev took office, but all were exacerbated by the financial crunch caused by the enormous government spending on armaments. Hoping to end the arms race, he quickly accepted the proposal of the American President Ronald Reagan for a summit meeting. The two leaders met on four occasions: in Geneva, 1985, Reykjavik, 1986, Washington, 1987, and in Moscow, 1988. The most dramatic result was the Arms Limitation Treaty signed in December 1987. This was the first treaty that actually reduced the number of nuclear weapons which the great powers had. In fact, an entire class of medium range missiles was eliminated entirely. Another action that reduced international tensions was Gorbachev's decision to remove the Soviet troops from Afghanistan. The Soviet army had invaded that country in 1979 during the Brezhnev's era and at first had considerable military success. But after Reagan's decision to supply the Afghan guerrillas with Stinger surface to air missiles, which greatly reduced the effectiveness of Soviet air power, the tide shifted, and the Soviets got bogged down in a long, inconclusive war. The outside world had always severely criticized the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the war was costly and unpopular at home. But Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, and at first Gorbachev too, had all been unwilling to pull out, fearing a loss of face. Finally, though, Gorbachev decided to cut his losses, and early in 1988 he signed an agreement providing for the withdrawal of all Soviet forces. The withdrawal was completed by the agreed date in February 1989. These changes in foreign policy were dramatic, but the bulk of Gorbachev's efforts were devoted to domestic matters. From the beginning, he saw that a major program of perestroika restructuring was needed in order to deal with the poor performance of the Soviet economy. As one aspect of this restructuring, the power of the Communist Party, which formerly had been in virtually complete control of the Soviet government, was greatly reduced under Gorbachev. On the economic level, the restructuring included the legalization of private enterprise in some fields. It should be noted that Gorbachev always insisted that he was a loyal follower of Marx and Lenin and a firm believer in socialism. His goal, he said, was merely to reform the communist system so that it would work better. Perhaps the most revolutionary of his reforms was the policy of glasnost, or openness, which Gorbachev instituted in 1986. One aspect of glasnost was more openness and candor by the government concerning its activities and concerning events of public interest. Another aspect was permitting private individuals or publications to discuss political matters freely. The publication of views whose expression just a few years earlier would have brought a prison sentence, perhaps a death sentence during the Stalin era, became commonplace under glasnost. It became possible for Soviet journals to criticize government policies, the Communist Party, high government officials, even Gorbachev himself. Another important step in the democratization of the USSR occurred in 1989, when popular elections were held for a new Soviet parliament. The Council of People's Deputies These were certainly not free elections in the Western sense. 90% of the candidates were members of the ruling Communist Party, and no other political parties were allowed. But the elections were held by secret ballot. They did involve a choice of candidates, and the votes were counted honestly. They were certainly the closest thing to free elections since the communists took power in 1917. The results of the elections came close as the rules allowed, to a vote of no confidence in the Communist Party. Many old line party leaders, including a few who ran unopposed, were defeated, and several outspoken dissidents were elected. Despite these impressive reforms within the USSR, nobody anticipated the cataclysmic changes that occurred in Eastern Europe in 1989 to 1990. That entire region had been occupied by Russian troops at the close of World War II, and in the 1940s, communist regimes, reliably subservient to the Soviet Union, had been established in six countries: Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. These regimes were generally unpopular, but their leaders, backed by the secret police and the army, had held sway for over 40 years. Even when a popular revolt succeeded in overthrowing one of the communist tyrants, as had occurred in Hungary in 1956, Soviet troops soon restored the communists to power. Although elections in Poland in June 1989 had clearly shown how little popular support the communists enjoyed in the region, as late as September 1989, it seemed that communist and Russian control of Eastern Europe was secure. By the end of the year, however, the entire system had collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. The trouble started in East Germany. Ever since the erection of the infamous Berlin Wall in 1961, many East Germans had wished to escape to the West, and many had been shot in a vain attempt to cross the wall to freedom. For years, the wall had been a grim symbol that East Germany, and in fact, all communist regimes, were little more than enormous prison camps. Nor could the East Germans cross over to the West at other points, as their government had sealed the entire border and had erected an extensive set of barbed wire fences, alarms, military patrols, minefields to catch would be escapees. However, in 1988 and 1989, many East Germans had succeeded in escaping by an indirect route, by first going to another East European country which was legal, and from there going to the West. In October 1989, Erich Honecker, the tough, hardline communist who had ruled East Germany for many years, tried to shut down this alternate escape route. A few days later, there were large demonstrations in East Berlin protesting Honecker's action. In this crisis, Gorbachev visited Berlin, urged Honecker not to delay reforms, warned him not to suppress the demonstrations by force, and made it clear that Soviet troops, there were 380,000 in East Germany at the time, would not be used against the East German population. Gorbachev's remarks forestalled a bloody crackdown by the East German police and army, while boosting the confidence of the protesters. Within a few days, a series of massive public demonstrations began in various East German cities. Within 2 weeks, Honecker was forced to resign. However, as his replacement, Egon Krenz was also a communist, and since the borders were still closed, the mass demonstrations continued. Finally, on November 9, Krenz announced that the Berlin Wall would be opened and that East Germans would be allowed to cross over freely to the west. Few announcements have caused such jubilation, and few have had such swift and profound consequences. Within a few days, millions of East Germans streamed across the border to see with their own eyes what life in the West was really like. What they saw convinced them that 44 years of communist rule had robbed them of both their freedom and their prosperity. The opening of the Berlin Wall provided remarkable confirmation of the philosopher's dictum that it is not the facts themselves that really matter, but the way that people view them. In the first few days after Krank's announcement, the wall was still physically intact, and in principle, the East German government could have reclosed the border at any time. But people behaved as if the border was permanently open, and since everybody acted this way, the effect was the same as if the wall really had been physically removed. Throughout Eastern Europe, people reacted to the destruction of the Berlin Wall much as the French population 2 centuries earlier had responded to the destruction of the Bastille. It was a dramatic indication that the tyrants had lost their power to oppress. In country after country, the people rose up against their masters and swept aside the communist regimes that had ruled them for so long. In Bulgaria, Todor Zhivkos, who had ruled that country with an iron hand for 35 years, was quickly forced to resign. A week later, massive demonstrations began in Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia. By December 10, these resulted in the resignation of President Gustav Husak and the relinquishment of power by the Communist Party. Husak was soon replaced as president by Jacques Havel, a prominent dissident who had spent the first few months of the year in jail as a political prisoner. The changes were even more rapid in Hungary. There, the government had legalized opposition parties in October 1989. Then, in free elections held on November 26, these new parties decisively defeated the communists, who relinquished power without bloodshed. In Poland, events moved faster still, and late in the year, the various victorious anti communists decided to completely scrap socialism and install a thoroughgoing free market economy starting January 1st, 1990. Egon Krenz in East Germany had perhaps hoped that by opening the border he would placate the opposition and end the protests. It did not work out that way. The protests continued and Krenz resigned as head of state on December 3, 1989. 4 days later, the government agreed to hold free elections, in which, not surprisingly, the communists were badly defeated. The last holdout was Romania. where hardline dictator Nikolai Ceausescu was determined not to relinquish his power. When demonstrations against his rule occurred in Timisoara on December 15, he had the army fire on the crowds. But the enraged populace would not be suppressed. The demonstrations continued, then soon spread to other cities. On December 25, Ceausescu was overthrown, captured, and executed. The last domino had fallen in Eastern Europe. These events, momentous in themselves, soon led to 1. The removal of Soviet troops from Czechoslovakia and Hungary, 2. Genuine elections in the newly freed states, 3. The abandonment of Marxism in several other countries that had been Soviet client states, for example, Mongolia and Ethiopia, 4. The reunification of Germany, completed on October 1990. More important than any of these changes, however, was the rapid growth of nationalist movements within the USSR. Despite its name, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was never a voluntary union. Rather, it was the successor to the old Russian Empire ruled by the Caesars, an assemblage of peoples brought together by conquest. The prison house of nations was how Westerners used to describe the Caesarist Empire. Many of those peoples had continued to desire their independence, such as the inhabitants of the old British, French, and Dutch empires had wanted freedom. It had been impossible to publicly express these yearnings under the iron rule of Stalin, or under the less brutal but still firm hand of his successors. But under Gorbachev's glasnost, these nationalist desires could be mentioned, and it was not long before organized movements arose. There was unrest in Estonia, in Latvia, in Moldavia, and in several other Soviet republics. But it was in tiny little Lithuania that matters first came to the breaking point. On March 11, 1990, following general elections in which the question of secession had been the principal issue, the Lithuanian parliament boldly declared that country's complete independence from the USSR. Technically, the Lithuanians were within their rights. For decades, the Soviet constitution had included a provision permitting any republic a right to secede. However, before Gorbachev, it had always been understood that any attempt to exercise that right would be firmly suppressed, with grievous consequences to those who made the attempt. Gorbachev's response was interesting. He promptly denounced the Lithuanian action as illegal, threatened dire consequences if it were not reversed, imposed an economic embargo, and paraded Soviet troops through the Lithuanian capital in a show of military force. But he did not crush the breakaway province by direct military force, nor did he shoot or even imprison the Lithuanian leaders, as Stalin surely would have done. Lithuania is a small country and in itself was neither economically nor militarily important to the Soviet Union. However, the example set by Lithuania was very important. When the Lithuanian attempt at secession was not promptly crushed, nationalists in all the other Soviet republics gained hope and courage.